really working hard, burning the midnight oil, they tend to feel over the years inspired to produce the same amount of effort for him. Basically, they just don't want to let him down. Now, I have seen some very, very talented teams fail because their coaches have been essentially lazy. The coach of the 1950s and 1960s into the early 1970s was basically a bloke that turned up for training, got the players to run a few laps of the oval, a game of touch football, a few tap moves, and then up to the pub for a belly full of beer. I noticed, for example, when I was lining up in a row of cars at a football ground in Sydney early in my career, about the fourth car in a whole, must have been about 20, 30 cars. And this was probably the seminal moment in my thought as a coach. Now, sitting in the car, and we were waiting for the groundsman to come over from the nearby leagues club to unlock the lock to let us all in. Now, behind me was probably about another 20 or 30 cars, players who'd driven from vast distances in a part-time era, many of whom were married and had young kids to get home to. And because the groundsman, who was a sort of a committee man of the club, wanted to have an extra couple of schooners, sometimes the gates of the ground would not be open, say from 5:30 into even 6:15. For the under-23 players that came on after the first and second grade players, particularly on a Tuesday night when they had to turn up at the same time as everybody else because the teams were then announced, some of them wouldn't have got home till 10:30 at night, particularly if they lived long distances. So I remember sitting in the car and thinking to myself, if ever I became a first grade coach, the one thing that I'm going to do is make training extremely punctual, well organised, structured, so that when they get there, the witches' hats are out on the field, the footballs are ready, the staminade's okay, the whole place will have been opened up an hour before for anybody who wanted to come, just to prize away from that one committee man whose great joy it was to wobble across from the leagues club half pissed and joking in the fact that he was holding everybody up. That was the semi-professional era of Sydney in the mid-70s. So I resolved then the most important thing I would do is to be organised and structured. And I also knew that players wanted to be given very clear, coherent directions. No double talk, no confused language. They wanted clear directions. Now, at this time in Sydney Rugby League, there was probably an anti-school teacher ethos in the code, that school teachers probably had whacked a couple of committee men or leaders in the game across the arse from time to time and were seen to be in poor flavour. It was a sort of, to some extent, an anti-intellectual environment. But significantly, within a couple of years, by the late 70s, 5 of the 12 first grade coaches were school teachers. There was myself at Western Suburbs, there was Teddy Glossop at Cronulla and later Canterbury, Warren Ryan at Newtown and later Canterbury, over at Manly, Alan Thompson, and Billy Anderson was at South Sydney. So you've got to ask yourself, why was this the case? Why did school teachers suddenly flourish in an anti-school teacher environment? Basically because they brought to the code those two things that I think were important, that is to say, organisational skills and communication skills. In fact, the only full-time coach who did not have a job at that time was Jack Gibson, and it was significant to me that he was probably the most successful of that era simply because he had that additional time and staff underneath him to do the things that those trained as organisational skill teachers and people with communication skills could do. So that was the first thing that I decided to do, and I can remember going on a Coach of the Year trip to the United States and sitting with a fellow by the name of Chuck Knox, who was coach of the Buffalo Bills. And I said to him, how did you start as a coach? And he said, well, I'll tell you. He said, I was a high school coach, just as a coach of a school team, and I looked around and I noticed that the players, at some terms they'd turn up on a Friday night for games and they'd have shitty old jumpers and some of them hadn't been washed. So I just went round to the town and I went to the local laundry and I said, will you launder all the players' jumpers for nothing? Yes. Will you supply this for nothing? And he said, I just worked on making things better for the players, trying to make their life a little bit easier. And he said, I grew from being a high school coach through to being a coach of a Super Bowl team. In fact, he took Los Angeles to the Super Bowl. So that's the sort of the lesson that I learnt very, very early in the piece. Now, there is nonetheless a corollary of a caring, thoughtful, hard-working coach, and that is that he can be guilty of what I perceive to be the biggest sin of all coaching, which is overcoaching. And if ever I could take all my time back and try and retrace my steps as a first grade coach, the one thing that I would try and edge back on is that tendency to overcoach, to give the players too much information. You've gathered so much information, you've sat watching videos for hours, and you want to pass it all on. Now these days I spend a lot of time, I live in Melbourne and I spend a lot of time with Melbourne Storm. I went with them to the World Club Challenge in Leeds in February of last year. And I'm consistently telling Craig Bellamy that same thing, try and not overcoach, and because he's an equally hard-working individual. And I'm pleased to say that he doesn't. There are times that he might border on it, but overall he doesn't. But that's another era, which I will come to as we go on talking. By the way, when I was up there in Buffalo Bill, up there in Buffalo with the Buffalo Bills, the coach said to me, he said, look, he said, I'll give you a player to go out with tonight. And I said, okay. He said, I've got to go somewhere, and I was going off the next day. So he introduced me to this player, the biggest, hardest, toughest guy you've ever seen in your life. And this player took me off to this pub, and he was sullen and surly, big bloke, and nobody went anywhere near him. And even the bar staff were a bit terrified of him. Anyway, we sat there, he hardly said a word for about 2 or 3 hours, and in the end I said, mate, why is the coach asking you to take me out? What's the go here? And he said, coach gets me to do things nobody else will do on the field. And he said, isn't that what happens with your team back in Australia? So somehow or other, my reputation at Western Suburbs had gone all the way across the Pacific up to Buffalo Bill, that I was this mad bloke that got players to do these crazy things. And the coach sent his baddest bloke out to entertain me for the evening. So that's another thing I've learned as a coach. No matter what you do, if you get a reputation, it sticks with you for life. And I've heard the introduction there about the face slapping, so I'll come back to that in a minute. So it's a structured, ordered existence, but let's get on to this overcoaching. As I said, you have so much knowledge, so much information that there's a tendency to want to pull it back. In late October last year, I went for a walk along the Great Ocean Road for about 3 or 4 days with John Singleton, who's a great mate of mine. And I said, we're going to do this 3 or 4 day walk. Let's get one of the players from our era who we can talk to a little bit as we walk along. It's doing about 9 hours walk a day. He said, let's get Graham O'Grady. Now, Graham O'Grady played with me at Wests, and he moved to Singo, where Singo was the chairman of Newtown, played for him for about 3 years, and then he rejoined me at St George. So he had been with both of us almost the entire period of his career. And at the end of it, we'd organised John Rebo and Craig Bellamy to turn up so that the 5 of us could just basically have a night after this walk. And I remember bringing up in front of Bellamy and and Graham O'Grady, something that Graham O'Grady had once said to me early in my career at Wests.